There are a number of features that make this the most unique lens released this year, but I think it is going to be a love it or hate it thing. You're going to either love the tactile use and the unique functionality and the conversation piece that this lens is, or you're going to think it's a complete gimmick and why on earth do you need something like this? But the headline feature of this lens is the fact that it is a collapsible lens. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent out to me by Thypoch. They've made a number of new lenses, including one of my favorite lenses of all time, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. This is a pretty niche lens, so it's only available from a couple of different suppliers, and I've put those links in the description down below. This is their new Eureka 50mm collapsible lens. And it's based on a lens design that dates back to the 1930s or thereabouts, and it comes in an M mount. Now, an M mount is a native mount for Leica cameras, Leica rangefinder cameras, but I like to buy M mount lenses because they allow me to mount them on any lens or any camera system with only a very small, thin adapter. And when we look at the collapsible functionality of this lens, it is a twist and collapse function. And right now, it still looks like a reasonable size lens because it's got the lens hood on, which is a clamp-on lens hood. But you take that off, and you now have a very, very small form factor. And I think this is probably the smallest 50mm f2 lens that you can buy right now. It also comes with a range of interesting accessories. To start with, we'll open that back up. We've got the lens hood that goes on, and it's held in place just by turning this little screw, and it clamps in place. But in addition to that, it also has a UV filter. Now, the UV filter will has a couple of different functions. Nowadays, people use UV filters on digital cameras as a protective filter for the front element of the lens, which is still what you could use this for. But because this is an M mount lens, there are people that are going to be using it on Leica film cameras, and UV filters still play a role in improving image quality when we're talking about film. So this gives you a protective filter if you're using a digital camera, but it gives you a functional UV filter if you're using a film camera. In addition to that, while it's on, you can also put this little slide-on lens cap that protects it. But if you don't want to use it, you take the filter off, and the lens cap still fits on like that. Now, Thypoch advertises this lens as a lens that's going to get you a vintage lens user experience, and you can see by using it, it looks and feels like a vintage lens. But they also say that it's designed to give you a little bit of that vintage look as well. It's a very simple design. It's a 6-element lens in 4 groups. And although they say it is designed to give you a bit of a vintage look, I think it is kind of a mix between a vintage look and a modern lens. I don't think it really looks like a vintage lens, and I say that in a good way. It kind of has the best of a modern lens and the best in a vintage lens as far as the image quality goes. But when in use and when in the hand, it does feel like a very, very high quality vintage lens, and it does give you a completely different tactile user experience compared to using any modern lens, whether that be a vintage lens or a budget or more expensive manual focus lens, of which Thypoch also makes. Now, looking at the image quality, this is where I was really surprised, because to have a simple lens design, usually we're going to have all kinds of problems, particularly like distortion, chromatic aberration. All these things tend to be a problem with vintage lenses, and when we try to reproduce that vintage lens look, often we get a lot of that. To start with, the distortion on this lens is effectively 0. Like, I cannot believe there is basically no distortion whatsoever. I mean, the lines are perfectly straight right to the edge of frame. Now, looking at Vignette, it does have reasonably strong Vignette, particularly wide open at f2. It gets better at f2.8, still decreasing by f4, but it never really goes away. So there's always a bit of Vignette. Now, in all honesty, when I'm using lenses for kind of a look, I like Vignette, and I add Vignette to a lot of my images. But in cases where you want to shoot it wide open at f2 and you have to brighten up those corners, you may get a little bit of ISO noise as you bring the corners up. Chromatic aberration is another common problem with vintage lenses or lenses that are reproduced to be like vintage lenses. This one has effectively none. I couldn't find any chromatic aberration, couldn't find any longitudinal chromatic aberration. Maybe if you're shooting test charts, you might find something, but in real world results, I didn't see any. And the other thing is flare control. The flare in this lens is so well controlled, but if you shoot it wide open at night, you still get these really soft and beautiful blooming highlights which I really, really liked. And I think as a nighttime street lens in a city, I think it could be an excellent choice just because of the way it renders the flare in those images. Now, this is a lens, a 50mm lens, usually are pretty good for like close-up images because of the design of this lens and the collapsible functionality. The minimum focus distance is a long way away. It's 0.9 meters. That's around about 3 feet. That is quite a long minimum focus distance, so you're not going to be using it for anything close up. The only thing disappointing to me about this is because it's a small, great, versatile travel lens, it might be a lens that at times you want to use for like food photography or flowers, that sort of macro photo that goes with traveling, those details of traveling, and it's really not going to be able to do that for you. If we look at the sharpness on the lens, this is probably the biggest surprise of them all, given its very low element count and its very simple design and both the collapsible functionality. The fact that this thing is sharp wide open at f2 was really surprising to me. I thought it was going to be a dreamy mess and you'd have to shoot it at f5.6 to get usable images. It is very sharp at f2. It's almost razor sharp at f2.8. And as you stop it down, it gets as sharp as any modern clinical lens that I own. And in addition to that, not only do you get a sharp and detailed image in the center of frame or wherever you're putting your subject, you do get an excellent creamy, dreamy background blur. I would probably rate it somewhere around an 8 out of 10. It also has somewhat of a swirly bokeh background look to it. So you just get a really sharp image, but you also get this beautiful sort of swirly bokeh. Now, one thing that I should mention about this lens that I'm not sure about, and you probably should be aware of, is that when you take it in and out, you do create this kind of suction thing. And if I put the rear lens cap on, and I'll try to do this in my microphone so you can hear it. So that is sucking of air in and out because it's almost like a plunger function if you look at it. So I think there is a risk, depending on what camera system or camera you're using, that it might be a risk of it sucking dust into the camera, onto the sensor, or into the rear elements of the lens. So just something to be aware of. It's not something that actually happened to me, but theoretically, I think it could be a problem. So while it is a super interesting lens, I have to ask, like, who would actually buy this? Who is this lens for? Well, to start with, I think it's someone who wants a unique sort of vintage lens shooting experience with kind of modern engineering and optics, and something that kind of is a mix between image character out of a vintage and a modern lens. I think it's also a very interesting conversation piece. So if you're just going out to a party with friends and family, just doing some sort of fun photography, you want to do some portraits, just taking this with you on a compact body, whether it be an M mount or you're adapting it to one of your other cameras, it's just kind of a cool little conversation piece to have with you. Now, the other people that I see is somebody who is shooting an M-mount camera and they want that camera package to be as small as possible. I think this is an excellent option. Collapsed, some of those cameras are going to be borderline pocketable. And I think for M-mount users, they're already kind of going for that vintage retro experience. And this is just going to add to that. Now, this isn't the first Thypoch lens that I have ever tested. They make a 28mm f1.4, and that is honestly one of my favorite lenses of all time. And I've just thrown a video on screen now. You'll see for both photo and video, I mean, this thing, everything looks like it's straight out of a Hollywood movie with that lens. And 28mm is also one of my very favorite focal lengths.